need to understand two specific forces, which come into play when moving the boat under power: prop wash and prop walk. When using the engine ahead, the rudder effect is particularly strong, since the rudder is being used to divert the powerful thrust from the propeller. This force is known as prop wash, and is very useful when manoeuvring in restricted situations. When going astern, prop wash flows forward and away from the rudder. In this situation, the rudder can only divert the water flow created by the boat's own momentum. The steering tends to be both less immediate and less positive. However, now another force, known as prop walk, comes into play. Most propellers, while screwing their way through the water, also tend to paddle the stern sideways at the same time. Think of the propeller as a wheel, rolling through the water, and this sideways movement becomes immediately obvious. When going ahead, this rolling or paddling effect is largely overcome by the greater force of the prop wash upon the rudder. However, when going astern, the interaction between prop wash and rudder does not exist, and then prop walk can exercise a significant force upon the boat and walk the stern across. This is particularly useful for me when I'm taking Tristan out of her berth in Bristol Marina. Here, the prop walk is helping me to make a sternboard to port in what is a very confined mooring.
When you're going in astern, the most important thing is to know which way the prop walk kicks the stern. A right-handed prop kicks the stern to port, a left-handed prop kicks the stern to starboard. So when you engage reverse gear, the boat will tend to go off one way or the other. If the stern kicks to port, for example, and you want to steer to starboard, you might not be able to do anything about it in the first boat's length. So the important thing is to build up a little bit of speed and then either reduce the revs substantially or knock the engine into neutral, and then the boat will be steered by the rudder. It won't be fighting the prop walk anymore. And then, as long as you have speed on the boat, the rudder will be able to steer it.
I think we better have another look at that.
Going in astern, you will find that the prop walk tends to kick the stern one way, and it may not be the way you want to go. So the important thing is to use enough throttle initially to get the boat moving in astern, then reduce the throttle or even knock the engine into neutral, and you'll find that the rudder will then steer the boat. So if you're going any distance in astern, you're approaching a pontoon in reverse, you'll want to play the throttle fairly continually, as well as moving the wheel of the tiller to line the boat up. So if you find the stern, for example, is too far to port, and you have a prop that kicks the stern to port, as is the case with this boat, build some speed up, have maximum lock on to bring the stern out to starboard, and then by knocking the engine out of gear, the stern will swing round the way you want it. So it's a matter of playing continually throttle and wheel or tiller to line the boat up, bearing in mind that the rudder will only exert any effect when the boat is moving. If the prop's kicking the stern one way, you want to make sure it's not fighting with the rudder. So you're facing aft, looking where you're going, and you're playing the throttle at the same time as controlling the rudder or the wheel to line the boat up. Now we know marinas are getting more congested, and Tristan is a big boat in a fairly tight slot, so how do you go about getting her into her berth?
Well, you're right there. Although Bristol is not as crowded as the south coast, we're still limited in space, and Tristan's berth is quite a difficult one. We have to make an approach at right angles to the marina and then immediately make a hard turn to starboard to get into our berth. And the only way I can actually do it is by setting the turn up, then pushing the bows as far into her berth as I can, then going astern and using prop walk to pull the stern around to port at the same time as it's slowing her up, squaring her up to the berth, and then making a slow approach in at the right angle. Bristol is a busy harbour, and you need to keep a careful watch on what is happening around you. As we approach our berth, it is important that the crew are on their toes. Graham will be responsible for that all-important midship spring, and so he positions himself for an easy step onto the pontoon hammerhead. The turn into our berth is very tight, and, as in the case with many other marinas, the pontoons are quite close together. There really is no room for error. Making the turn, I go astern to slow us down, and use prop walk to take our stern to port. Now with Tristan completing the manoeuvre, I can motor very gently ahead, bringing her starboard side close to the pontoon finger, for Graham to have plenty of time to judge his step ashore without any need for acrobatics. Then, of course, the other thing that we need to do is to make sure we stop when we get into the berth before we hit the pontoon. And there I find the single spring with us, the midship position, that goes on to a cleat at the far end of the finger, and then I can motor against that spring, and by putting prop wash either to port or starboard on by moving the helm across, I can keep the boat parallel with the pontoon while the crew sort out the lines, the bow and stern lines, and the fore and aft springs.
Spring, please, Graham.
With this midship spring onto the pontoon cleat, Tristan is secure. The pressure is off. Now Graham goes forward to take the starboard bow line. Being in our home port, all lines are ready and to the right length, with snubbers attached. Next comes the bow spring. To ease the task for Graham, I motor against the midship spring, so to bring Tristan closer to the pontoon. Then comes the starboard stern line, once again already made up to the right length. Finally, the port bow line. Because Tristan faces the prevailing winds, we take care that these heavy ropes can take the surging loads of the winter gales. Though in this instance, because the mooring is temporary, we haven't taken the loop through and over the cleat, as we would for a permanent attachment. But I think it's also important to remember that the single spring is very useful when you're short-handed, or in fact single-handed.
Approaching a leeward berth, you want to come in allowing for a little bit of leeway, because you're going to be crabbing down onto the pontoon slightly. You don't need to be going too fast. The boat should carry a certain amount of weight. What I then do is to have the spring already fixed up, the fenders already in position, bring the boat in with the bow slightly upwind, because as soon as you get alongside the pontoon, the bow will tend to blow in, so you're crabbing in, bow slightly upwind. You can keep the boat in gear. If you're not moving too fast, that means that once you drop that spring over the cleat, the boat is already powering forward against the spring. So approach gently, there's no need for any great speed. So you're crabbing, you'll slightly bow out. It's best to keep the engine in gear, so you're still moving ahead, powering ahead as you come alongside, but very, very gently. Then just move forward from the cockpit, drop the spring over the pontoon cleat. The give and the line brings the boat to a nice gentle halt. Then use a little bit more throttle and put the helm to leeward. That will keep the bow out and make sure the boat remains parallel to the pontoon, because the natural tendency is for the bow to be blown in those conditions. You can lash the helm to leeward to make sure it stays in the right place. Once you've done that, the boat's securely held, it won't be going anywhere. You can take your time, step onto the pontoon and start putting on the bow line, the stern line and the other springs. But the important thing is that you've made the initial approach from on board, and you don't need to step off the boat until everything is nice and secure.
Now I do notice that you've shown that action on a leeward berth, when the wind is blowing you nicely down, so you're not going anywhere if you make a mistake. But can you apply the same technique if you're having to berth to a windward berth, where the wind is taking the boat away from the pontoon?
If anything, it's even more useful in those conditions, because on a leeward berth, if you do get it wrong, you're not likely to go very far. On a windward berth, if you get it wrong, you might well blow off the pontoon onto another boat on the other side. So approaching a windward pontoon can be trickier. So Again, the boat's being blown to leeward, this time off the pontoon. So you want to approach nice and tight. If there's a boat in front of you, come in as close as you can. And then just flip the bow round at the last moment so that you approach the pontoon parallel. Again, it's best to keep the engine in ahead if you can. The boat's only moving gently. Then just move forward from the cockpit and drop the spring over the cleat. Again, the spring and the line will make sure the boat isn't brought to an abrupt halt. Put some more power on, so you're motoring forward against the spring. Again, you'll want to keep the helm to leeward, this time to make sure the bow doesn't get blown off. The pivot point, as adjusted by the length of the line coming back over the deck to which the spring is attached, will be slightly further forward this time to counteract the natural tendency of the bow to blow off. Then lash the helm to port. Make sure you have enough revs on the engine to keep the boat in against the pontoon. Again, there's no hurry. Once the spring is secured, the engine is in gear, the helm's to leeward, you've got all the time in the world to get the other lines ashore.
On Tristan, we have a centre ship cleat, or centre ship bollard actually, which is substantial and which can be extremely useful, and I use it all the time for springs. But I noticed on the boat that you were sailing in Poole that there wasn't a centre ship cleat, a midship cleat, and you had to improvise with a long rope from the bows coming back, and you'd made that off in a bowline at one end, and then you took a line through that, and that second line became effectively your spring. Now, what was your reason for doing that, other than the fact that you didn't have a midship cleat?
The advantage of that is that you can vary the length of that long line fore and aft, which adjusts the pivot point of the boat. So when you're coming into a leeward berth, you can move that point further aft to help keep the bow out. When you're coming into a windward berth and the bow tends to blow off, you can move that pivot point slightly further forward to help keep the bow in. That's one advantage, because a spring cleat, on most boats, if they have it, it'll be fairly well amidships, and that tends to mean that the boat will lie alongside a pontoon with a fairly bow-in attitude. So by using this length of line from the bow, A, you can move that pivot point further aft and put it where you want it, and B, a very important point, is that that length of line gives you quite a lot of stretch, so that if you come in moving as you do, as you drop the spring onto the pontoon cleat, the boat isn't brought up short, as it would be with a spring taken to a midship cleat where you might only have 2 or 3 feet of line. In this case, you might have 20 or 30 feet of line, and so you have several inches of give, so the boat is brought to a halt far more gently. So using this system of lines can still be very advantageous.
In other words, that long line from the bows coming back provides you with considerable surge potential. It will take the way off the boat smoothly rather than abruptly.
Absolutely, yes. I mean, it really is. It's acting as a spring.
When you were leaving the berth, you were single-handed and you were coming off astern. You used a very neat slipping knot, which meant that the spring came away and you were on the boat and the boat was on its way. How does that knot work?
That knot to slip the spring was the Swain slip, as developed by Richard Swain. It uses the principle of shortening the line by putting a loop through a couple of other loops, which then hold the line when it's under tension, but enable the line to be undone, enable the knot to be undone when the tension comes off and it's pulled from the opposite direction. So you can stay on board, take the boat out of ahead, put it into reverse, and then as soon as the weight comes off it, pull the free end, and you're away.
I think we'd better have another look at that.
So before you start springing off, you want to get a couple of fenders over the bow. One might do, but it's just as well to use 2 to be on the safe side. You want to spend some time making sure they're the right height, because the bow will be pressing in fairly hard against the pontoon as you swing the stern out. It's not always easy to judge the precise height when the bow is a little way out from the pontoon. especially with a boat that has a raked stem. Then you bring the bowspring aft, take a bite through or around the cleat on the pontoon, quite a long bite, probably 3 or 4 feet. Then make a loop in the standing part, feed the bite through that, and then repeat another loop, put the bite through again, and then make sure it's all nice and clear on the pontoon. You then want to tension that line to keep the load on it, because that knot, the swain slip, only holds when there's tension on the line. So if you need to just go up forward, take any slack out of the line, tension it around the cleat again. When you've done that, you want to start dropping the rest of the lines, take off the stern line, the bow line, and the other springs with the engine in gear, so you're then powering forward against your bowspring, and that's what's holding the boat in position at that stage. Especially when the wind's blowing the boat onto the pontoon, which is when you need to use this technique of springing off. There's no hurry, because the boat's not going to be going anywhere too fast until you start powering ahead against the spring. Use plenty of rudder to swing the stern out, a bit more throttle to bring the bow in against the pontoon. That's when you need to make sure that the fenders really are doing their job. Get the stern out as far as you can. And then when you've got enough of an angle on the boat, take the power off and ahead, go into stern. Then the weight comes off the line. Give it a good pull from the cockpit. The knot will slip. The line's on board and you're away. And you've done it all from the cockpit without any help from anybody on the pontoon. The great thing about this knot is that it holds securely when the boat's powering against it. As long as there's load on it, it holds. As soon as the load comes off and you pull the free end on the boat, it slips.
Dave, whilst we're looking at springs, it's just as well to remember that the spring is a very useful means of getting the boat off a leeward berth when you're pinned down by the wind against the pontoon. You're wanting to get either the bows or the stern off.
Indeed, or if you just pinned in with the boat very tight either way, ahead and astern of you, and there's no other way of getting out other than to spring the bow or the stern out, and effectively you're almost going out sideways then, which is what we did with the MG from a very tight berth with boats ahead and astern. I think the first time we went by springing the bow in and the stern out and going out astern, which you can do very usefully with that forward spring. Okay, I'm just going to put the boat and tick over ahead, so we'll take the weight off the aft spring. So let me just engage gear, and that will then effectively make that spring redundant. Okay, if you like to drop that spring off now, I'll just make sure the boat holds station. So first of all, to put the engine in tick over and ahead, because the wind and the tide were blowing us on and slightly aft. If we had dropped the aft spring without putting the engine in ahead, we'd have ended up drifting onto the boat astern. Right, now the bow line is doing nothing, so would you like to slip that next? Put lock on the wheel so that you're steering the boat into the pontoon. Then you can drop the bow line, because the bow will be coming in. Okay, I'm going to slip the stern line in a moment. Go ahead a bit further. Few more revs. So then if you're ready on that spring, which we'll be motoring against, ready to slip that, so make sure it's all free to run. If you keep it on the cleat for now, because we're going to be motoring against it, there's going to be quite a load on it. And then once I've slipped the stern line and got the stern out far enough, I'll then come into neutral to take the weight off that, and then you want to slip it fairly rapidly. I'll need to start going astern, otherwise the stern's going to blow back in. make sure that fender's doing its job. And then putting the engine in ahead a little bit harder. With the fenders well forward, of course, because then you're going to be warping, effectively swinging the bow in. So you want to make sure that you've got something to stop the bow going into the pontoon. And just keep on powering ahead against that spring until the bow comes in, the stern goes out far enough so that you're clear of the boat behind. Slip as soon as you like now.
Okay.
And of course you want to reverse the lock on the wheel, go astern and slip the bow on a spring. The important thing, of course, when you're slipping the bow on a spring is to make sure that you slip the short end and that there aren't any loops or eyes in the end of the line, so it'll run through the cleats
All clear.
on the boat and on the pontoon, because you need to slip it fairly rapidly. Once you've engaged reverse gear and you're backing out, you don't want something to snag. So you want to make sure that your foredeck hand has got the short end ready to slip fairly rapidly, and then you go out in the stern and you can pull the stern out to probably 30 or 40 degrees from the pontoon like that. And it's a very useful technique.
And how about when you want to spring the bows off?
Well, there might be times when you want to go the other way, of course. In that case, it's the reverse procedure. You will take off the bow spring first, because that's not going to be doing anything for you, making sure that you don't drift back onto the boat, the stern.
Okay, spring.
You can then drop the bow line off as well, to make sure the bow comes out. Right, so I'm now going gently in astern. Swing that back slightly and you can do it. Would you like to slip that stern line? Then you'll drop the stern line. The fender's doing the business, isn't it?
Absolutely.
Yes. Right, then as soon as that's out of the way, I'm going to keep the boat in the stern now and we'll see how far we can get that bow out. You'll steer with the wheel to get the rudder to bring the boat into the pontoon.
Just hold it there.
You'll then motor astern against the aft spring, having made sure before you start this that you've got your fenders fairly well aft so that you've got something to protect the stern. Use a fair amount of reverse, swing the bow out, and then when you're happy the bow is going to clear the boat ahead, go into neutral, drop the stern spring, again making sure that you're slipping the short end so that it comes back on the boat without snagging anything. And then reverse lock and motor out forward. And again, you may not get the boat round quite as far with the bow out as you would if you're springing off the other way because of the shape of the boat. But it's an effective way of getting out of a tight hole. So as long as you've got your fenders in the right place and you've got plenty of long warps, long enough to double back on the boat, it can get you out of a tight hole very successfully.
The use of springs is not the only way that yachtsmen can make life easier for themselves. Mast and cockpit winches